Listen carefully. What you're about to hear was never meant to leave the walls. These halls were designed to keep secrets inside, secrets about power, control, and the quiet disposal of human lives. You've seen the photographs, towering red brick asylums rising like fortresses over the American landscape, their lawns trimmed, their facades dignified. They told the public these were temples of healing, but behind those gates, the screams never left the walls, and once you entered, you weren't expected to return. Understand this. America's state hospitals were not simply about madness or mercy or even medicine. They were instruments, and instruments are built with purpose, to remove, to erase, to hide what society did not want to face, the poor, the broken, the inconvenient. They were taken in and swallowed whole by an institution that promised light and delivered silence. Picture this. A family, desperate, ashamed, perhaps pressured by a local doctor or a priest, arrives at the heavy wooden doors. A child who would not sit still, a wife who would not obey, a soldier too haunted to work again. They are led inside. The door shuts, the paperwork is signed, and then, gone. Years blur into decades, letters intercepted, names erased. The state had custody now, a living person reduced to a file number, stored inside walls that the public never saw beyond. And yet, what do you think happens when a nation builds vast prisons of the mind and leaves them unchecked for a century? When budgets collapse, when doctors vanish, when patients outnumber staff by hundreds to one, what do you think grows in silence? Neglect is the gentle word. The truth is closer to horror. Human beings tied naked to benches for days at a time. Children force-fed experiments, not food. Wards so overcrowded that the living slept beside the dying, and the dead went unnoticed until morning rounds. This was no medicine. This was containment masquerading as compassion. But that's only the surface layer, the part they eventually let slip into public record. The deeper truth, the one you were never meant to discover, was that some of these hospitals became testing grounds, controlled environments where the boundaries of psychology, pharmacology, and obedience could be pushed to their absolute limit. Not just hospitals, laboratories. Think about that. Buildings designed to hold thousands of vulnerable, voiceless people, hidden from oversight, easily written off as unreliable witnesses. What better population could there be for experiments no one was meant to see? By the 20th century, as wars erupted and intelligence agencies grew bolder, state hospitals provided exactly that: invisible human stockpiles. Patients became test subjects for mind control programs, for chemical interventions, for surgical procedures that rewired not just the brain, but identity itself. Here, under the guise of treatment, the state could explore what it had always craved: control over the human mind, to erase memory, to implant obedience, to study submission. And you should ask yourself, if a government discovers a place where it can manipulate reality itself, do you really think it would stop? Do you think those experiments ended? Or do you think they evolved? Walk with me deeper. Imagine the corridors, the smell of ammonia and iron, the paint peeling from walls damp with decades of condensation, the sound of restraints clinking in the dark, nurses trained not in care, but in compliance, patients lined in silence, rocking, vacant-eyed from drugs slipped into their rations, not healing, conditioning, a slow, deliberate remolding of the human mind into something more manageable. Understand this: the asylum was never a mistake of history. It was a blueprint. What begins behind brick walls spreads outward. What is tested on the powerless eventually becomes policy for the world outside. What they perfected in secret, restraint, sedation, surveillance, would one day leak into schools, prisons, workplaces. And if you think that's exaggeration, ask yourself why the architecture of hospitals, schools, and correctional facilities echoes the same cold geometry. Ask yourself why the same state that starved its patients now starves its citizens of truth. You are not just listening to history, you are listening to a mirror, because the story of the asylums is not about the past. It is about the hidden machinery of control, perfected in silence and refined over generations. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. This is the descent. Every corridor darker than the last, every door locked for a reason, and every revelation more dangerous than the one before. Welcome to the truth you were never meant to hear. Welcome to the state hospital. They called them temples of healing. That was the phrase used in speeches, in pamphlets, in newspaper clippings now yellowed with age. Governors stood on grand marble steps with scissors in their hands, cutting ribbons while bands played patriotic music. These hospitals were sold to the public as symbols of compassion, monuments to a civilization finally enlightened enough to care for its most fragile members. And families believed them. Mothers and fathers left their children at the gates, whispering promises that they would be cared for, that the state would do what they could not. The illusion was perfect. The architecture itself was a mask. Long corridors designed to catch the light, towers rising like cathedrals, wards staggered across vast green lawns in patterns they claimed were therapeutic. This was not an accident. Architects like Thomas Kirkbride insisted that the environment itself could cure the soul. Windows for fresh air, trees for calm, fields for labor. Every brick laid spoke of optimism, of humanistic science. But architecture has two faces, one that speaks outward to the public and one that speaks inward to those it holds. Behind those long rows of windows, iron bars ensured no one left. Behind those endless corridors, men and women sat locked in rooms that echoed with silence. The very design that dazzled the eye also erased the person. The great irony is this: the buildings were designed as much for concealment as for healing. You could drive past the grounds, see the shining red brick, the neatly kept gardens, and never imagine the hunger, the stench, the moans of those stacked inside. The mask worked. Consider what it means for a society to invest in hiding its vulnerable rather than healing them. By the late 19th century, many hospitals were already collapsing under overcrowding. Institutions built for a few hundred held thousands, beds crammed shoulder to shoulder, corridors filled with straw pallets where patients lay like discarded bodies, food stretched so thin that malnutrition became routine. When inspectors came, patients were dressed in clean clothes, wards scrubbed overnight, and the sickest hidden in basements. Society saw only the staged illusion, the fresh paint, the tidy lawns. This was the great performance of the state hospital, to convince the world it was humane, while it quietly became a warehouse of suffering. And suffering was only the beginning. Once an institution is hidden from oversight, once its inhabitants are stripped of voice, what stops the mission from shifting? First containment, then experimentation. If you study the records carefully, old archives, congressional testimony, the scattered testimonies of survivors, you see the pattern. The hospitals were perfect incubators for tests that could not be run in the open. Electroshock treatments without anesthesia, ice baths to induce compliance, chemicals tested in dosages no sane doctor would ever risk on the public. And later, as the 20th century shadow deepened, whispers of programs linked to military and intelligence agendas. Think of the timing, the 1940s, the 1950s, when intelligence agencies hunted for ways to break the human mind and rebuild it. When the CIA quietly launched projects with names that still echo like ghosts, MKUltra, Artichoke, Bluebird. Where do you think they looked for test subjects? Not in universities, not in corporate offices. They went where oversight could be erased, to prisons, to orphanages, and to state hospitals. Imagine the efficiency. Thousands of patients already deemed insane, their words discredited before they are even spoken. Who would believe them if they claimed the doctors were injecting them with strange substances? Who would believe them if they whispered that their thoughts were being monitored, their memories tampered with? Their testimony would be discarded as delusion before it ever left the ward. The perfect cover. But don't think this was just about science. It was about control. What these hospitals incubated was not simply medical neglect, but an entire philosophy of management, that the human being could be reduced to compliance, that behavior could be molded, silenced, contained, and when a society accepts that premise inside its hospitals, it eventually spreads outside. The asylum was a proving ground, the techniques of sedation, of forced obedience, of reshaping the mind. They did not stay locked behind those walls. They seeped outward, into schools that trained children to sit in silence, into prisons that demanded obedience through deprivation, into workplaces designed like wards. When you walk through the ruins of these hospitals today, you see the echoes, long corridors, peeling paint, rusted beds bolted to the floor. But if you look deeper, you see something else. The blueprint, The idea that control is not about chains and whips, but about silence, about erasure, about stripping identity until nothing remains but compliance. That blueprint was born in brick and mortar, but it didn't die with the demolitions. It lives on in systems you still walk through every day. The school, the office, the prison, the military, the hospital. Each one echoing the asylum in form and function. Each one demanding the same thing, conformity. This is why history matters, because the asylum was not simply a place for the broken. It was a stage, a mask, a laboratory. And if you only remember it as a failed experiment in mental health, you will miss its darker truth. It was the seed of a philosophy that governs far more of your life than you realize. Now ask yourself, if this is what they built openly, with ribbon cuttings and photographs in the papers, what do you think they built in secret? Close your eyes for a moment. Picture the room, not the manicured lawns outside, not the grand staircases where governors shook hands. Picture the ward itself, white tiles stained with yellow cracks, the smell of bleach fighting against the stench of unwashed bodies. A single iron bed bolted to the floor, straps dangling from its sides like quiet threats. Overhead, the flicker of a buzzing fluorescent light. And then, footsteps. The door opens. Men in white coats enter, their voices clipped, clinical, stripped of emotion. You are not a patient to them. You are not a person. You are a subject. This is where the mask falls away. This is where treatment becomes experiment, electroconvulsive therapy. Today it is sanitized, regulated, administered with anesthesia and monitoring. But in the mid-20th century, inside the walls of state hospitals, it was delivered raw, electric current coursing through skulls without sedation. Patients tied down, thrashing as their muscles convulsed, teeth shattering against leather straps. The procedure was repeated not once, not twice, but sometimes dozens of times in a single week. Records show patients crawling on the floor after sessions, unable to recognize their own names. And yet administrators reported progress. Progress, they said, because silence had been achieved. But silence is not healing. Silence is compliance. And compliance was all they ever wanted. Next came the knife, the lobotomy, a word that still carries a shiver of dread, but few understand its scale. Surgeons called it a miracle of modern science. Families were told it would calm their restless loved ones, erase aggression, restore peace. What they were not told was that peace meant obliteration. A thin metal rod slid behind the eye socket, hammered upward into the brain with a mallet, then swiveled side to side, severing the fibers of the frontal lobe. Personality erased. Identity smothered. Patients who once screamed now sat docile, drooling, childlike. Some died on the table. Others lived on as shadows, empty shells, their wills cut out like tumors. The state hospitals became factories of lobotomy. By the 1940s and 1950s, thousands were performed across the country. Children as young as 12, housewives who resisted their roles, veterans who returned too broken from war to be useful. The operation was quick, efficient, and irreversible, a perfect solution for institutions that could no longer contain the chaos of overcrowded wards. Fewer screams, fewer outbursts, fewer demands for dignity, a population of the quiet and the broken. But even the knife was not enough, because power always hungers for more. By the mid-century, whispers spread of chemicals being tested behind closed doors. Patients injected with experimental compounds, their reactions noted in files that rarely left the hospital basement. Some drugs were designed to sedate, others to agitate. Dosages pushed beyond reason, patients left drooling, staggering, hallucinating, trapped in chemically induced storms. And still, administrators recorded progress. Not recovery, but control. Always control. Now step deeper. Because if you follow the trail, you find something darker still. The connection between state hospitals and military intelligence. In the years after World War II, America learned a new lesson, that the battlefield of the future would not be fought with tanks and rifles, but with the human mind. The Nazis had conducted experiments in their camps, brutal and unthinkable. But America did not simply condemn those methods, it studied them, absorbed them, and then hid them behind its own walls. The CIA's MK Ultra program is whispered of now like a myth. But it was no myth. It was a network of secret projects aimed at one goal: mastering the art of breaking and remaking the human psyche. And where do you think they found their subjects? Not in boardrooms, not in laboratories with volunteers. They went to prisons, to orphanages, to state hospitals, places where the powerless could be silenced forever. Patients were given LSD in doses so massive they slipped into psychosis. Some were left in isolation rooms for weeks, with recordings of the same phrase looping endlessly through hidden speakers, an attempt to erase identity and implant new commands. Others endured combinations of drugs, electroshock, and hypnosis in sequences designed to dismantle the mind layer by layer. Many never returned to themselves. Some never returned at all. And ask yourself, how many files were shredded? How many bodies buried in unmarked graves, dismissed as natural deaths inside institutions where disease and neglect already claimed thousands? How many names erased so that the experiments could proceed without interference? The truth is scattered in fragments, declassified documents with black bars covering the most damning details, but survivors' testimonies echo with the same refrain. I was treated like an object. I was broken. I was remade. Now pause. Understand the scale of this. When you strip the mask away, when you burn through the lies of medicine and benevolence, what you see is not a hospital at all. You see a machine built to test how far control can go, how much pain the human mind can endure, how identity itself can be dismantled. And that machine did not stop when the asylums fell. It evolved. The techniques refined in those wards, shock, chemical sedation, behavioral programming, they seeped outward, into interrogation rooms, into psychiatric practice, into advertising and media. Because once a government learns how to break a mind, it will never unlearn it. This is the revelation few can face. The asylum was not an aberration. It was a prototype. And the techniques they tested on the forgotten were later refined for the world outside. Do you understand now why the walls were so high? Why the gates were so heavy? It wasn't just to keep the patients in, it was to keep the truth out. If you want to understand the true power of the asylum, you cannot stop at the walls, the drugs, or even the experiments. You must see the system that protected it. Because cruelty is not sustained by accident. It is sustained by design. And the most dangerous design of all is concealment. Every institution that endures in darkness must master the art of the mask, and America's state hospitals perfected it. You see, neglect could have been exposed, abuse could have been confronted, experiments could have been stopped, but they weren't, because the system built around these hospitals was designed to blind the public, pacify the families, and protect the administrators. Start with the reports. Every year, each hospital filed a thick stack of documents, statistics, summaries, inspections, budgets. To the casual reader, they looked official, professional, reliable. They spoke of progress, improvement, innovation. They listed new equipment purchased, new programs launched, advances in patient care. But buried in those same pages, always at the back, always in cold numbers, were the deaths: tuberculosis, influenza, starvation, suicide, hundreds each year. They were never told as stories, never given names, just figures on a page, swallowed by bureaucratic language. And who, after all, reads the fine print? Then there were the letters. Families wrote constantly, pleas for updates, questions about treatment, cries for help from loved ones trapped inside. But letters from patients rarely reached the outside world intact. Administrators intercepted them, read them, and censored them. Any complaint, any detail of mistreatment, any sign of desperation, and was labeled delusional. Letters were destroyed or rewritten. Families received only what the hospital wanted them to see: polite notes about progress, vague assurances of improvement. Meanwhile, the real words, the hunger, the abuse, the fear, were erased. Even inspections were theater. Legislators and committees occasionally demanded to see conditions firsthand. And when they came, the hospitals transformed overnight. Wards scrubbed until the smell of bleach stung the air. Patients dressed in clean gowns lined up neatly in day rooms. Dining halls set with steaming food, far more generous than the rations served on ordinary days. And those patients who could not be presented, the violent, the mutilated, the broken, were hidden in basements or sent on long walks until the inspectors left. What those visitors saw was an illusion. Quiet wards, clean halls, content patients. What they didn't see were the shackles removed only hours before, the sores hidden under clothing, the smell of rot lingering in the wings they were never allowed to enter, but concealment ran deeper still. When whistleblowers tried to speak, attendants who could no longer bear the neglect, doctors horrified by what they witnessed, the institution struck back. They were dismissed as disgruntled, accused of exaggeration, sometimes fired outright. Their warnings were buried in bureaucratic archives, their voices discredited before they could gain traction. The system had one golden rule: the credibility of the institution always outweighs the credibility of the individual. And in that equation, the patient, already labeled insane, had no credibility at all. Understand the brilliance of this structure. Every crack in the wall was patched before light could seep in, families reassured, inspectors deceived, whistleblowers silenced, journalists delayed until stories lost momentum. And when the rare expose did break through, when photographs or testimony reached the public, the administrators had their script ready. They framed the abuse as an isolated incident, a single bad apple in a system that was otherwise functioning as intended. They promised reform, new oversight, new funding. And then, once the outrage died down, the machine continued exactly as before. The genius of concealment is not just in hiding the truth, it is in shaping the perception of truth itself. Think of the photographs circulated in pamphlets, patients strolling through gardens, smiling nurses guiding them, bright porches filled with fresh air. These images were propaganda, crafted to overwrite the darker reality. They told the public, your loved ones are safe here, progress is happening here, trust us. And the public, eager to believe, did. But concealment was not only external, it was internal. Patients themselves were taught to doubt their own perception. When they complained of hunger, they were told it was in their head. When they resisted, they were told it was illness. When they begged to leave, they were told they were not ready. Every act of resistance was reframed as pathology. Every cry for help was proof that they needed to stay longer, to endure more treatment. This is the cruelest form of concealment, not when you hide the truth from the outside world, but when you convince the victim that their suffering is their own fault. And in that silence, neglect became normal. Abuse became routine. Experimentation became possible. Because once you erase the possibility of exposure, there are no limits left. Do you understand? Secrecy does not just protect abuse. Secrecy breeds abuse. It is the soil in which corruption thrives. Think of the architecture again. The long wings, the barred windows, the endless repetition of brick and stone. These were not just physical walls, they were symbolic walls. They told the world, what happens here is not for you to see, and society obeyed. It looked away, it trusted the experts, it accepted the mask. But masks cannot last forever. Every mask cracks, and when it does, the truth leaks out in fragments. A photograph smuggled out, a survivor's testimony whispered decades later, a file declassified with names blacked out but enough detail to chill the blood. These fragments are all we have, and they point to something far larger, far darker than any single report can contain. The asylum was not just a place of silence, it was a factory of silence. And its product was obedience, obedience from patients, obedience from families, obedience from the public. And once obedience is secured, the door to anything at all swings wide open. So when you ask yourself how such horror could have gone on for so long, the answer is simple. It wasn't hidden despite the system. It was hidden because of the system. Concealment was the system. And that system did not die with the asylums. It still lives in every institution that masks its true face, in every bureaucracy that reduces suffering to statistics, in every authority that demands your trust while hiding its hand. Now you begin to see. The silence of the asylum was not an accident. It was a blueprint. If the walls of the asylum were built to contain, and the mask of bureaucracy was built to conceal, then the next layer of control was psychological. Because what is the ultimate goal of any institution that feeds on silence? Not just to lock away the body, but to reshape the mind itself. From the first moment a patient entered, the process of erasure began. Intake was not simply paperwork. It was ritual. Clothes stripped, hair cut, personal items confiscated. Every possession that connected a patient to their former life was taken. Rings, photographs, letters, all seized. What remained was a uniform, the same rough gown, the same shoes, the same number sewn onto a chart. In a single day, individuality was erased. You were no longer a person. You were a patient, a case file, an object. Think about what that does to memory. Without tokens of the outside world, without reminders of who you once were, your identity begins to blur. Days bleed together. Your old life becomes dreamlike, less real. You forget. And forgetting is the first step toward control. Next came the schedules, dawn bells, roll calls, meals at precise hours, the same food ladled onto the same trays, work assignments in gardens or laundries, mandatory recreation. Bedtime at 9 sharp. The structure was absolute. Resistance was impossible. And when your every movement is dictated, when choice is eliminated, you stop thinking of yourself as a chooser at all. Routine becomes identity. Compliance becomes survival. But this was not enough. For the institution, order was not only about routines. It was about obedience. And obedience was enforced through punishment disguised as treatment. Electroconvulsive shocks for those who shouted too loudly. Ice baths for those who refused orders. Solitary confinement in dark cells for those who resisted. Each punishment framed as therapeutic, but its real purpose was behavioral correction. The lesson was simple. Disobey, and you will suffer. Obey, and you may be left in peace. This was not random cruelty. This was conditioning. A system of reward and punishment designed to break resistance and reshape behavior. In psychological terms, it was operant conditioning. Decades before the term became fashionable, the asylum was a laboratory of obedience long before the psychology textbooks caught up. And when you are punished enough, when shocks and restraints and cold silence are repeated over and over, something inside fractures. Some fought back until the end, but many broke. They stopped complaining. They stopped resisting. They learned to smile when ordered, to sit when told, to walk in step with the group. Their silence was not healing. It was learned, manufactured, engineered. Do you see it now? The asylum was not just a hospital. It was a machine for manufacturing obedience. And here lies the most chilling truth. Once you strip a person of their identity, once you reduce them to silence and compliance, they become the perfect subject for something else, experimentation. Because who is easier to test upon than someone who has been conditioned to accept anything? Who is more convenient than a patient who has been taught that resistance equals punishment, that compliance equals survival? That is why the reprogramming was never accidental. It was preparation. Preparation for the injections. Preparation for the shocks. Preparation for the drugs. Preparation for the files stamped with words like behavioral trial, chemical study, neurological experiment. Patients were groomed not just to obey their caretakers, but to submit to whatever procedure was demanded of them. And there was another layer still, perhaps the cruelest of all. Patients were systematically convinced that their suffering was deserved, that their pain was evidence of illness, that their compliance was proof of healing. If you screamed during shock therapy, it was proof you needed more. If you resisted a drug, it was proof you required higher doses. If you begged to leave, it was proof you were still unwell. Every instinct for survival, every spark of resistance was reframed as pathology. This is psychological inversion, turning the victim's cry into evidence of guilt. It is not healing. It is gaslighting on an industrial scale. And once that inversion takes root, something happens that is terrifying to witness. Patients begin to police themselves. They silence their own doubts. They question their own memories. They comply before punishment even arrives. The asylum's greatest trick was not forcing silence, it was as teaching silence so well that the patient carried it inside themselves. Understand what that means. By the time experiments began, whether with drugs or shocks, or even stranger procedures, the groundwork was already complete. The mind was prepared. The subject was compliant. The experimenter could proceed without resistance, without exposure, without fear. Now imagine this replicated not on dozens, not on hundreds, but on tens of thousands of patients across the country. A silent population of test subjects, their identities erased, their obedience manufactured, their suffering reframed as healing. Entire wards of men and women whose very sense of self had been dismantled and rebuilt into silence. And here is the echo you must not ignore. This model of reprogramming did not stay in the asylum. Like the architecture, like the concealment, it spread. Schools adopted similar tactics: uniforms, stripped individuality, rigid schedules, punishments disguised as lessons. Prisons became harsher mirrors, numbers instead of names, solitary confinement as correction. Military boot camps took the same logic to its extreme, breaking the recruit down to rebuild them into obedience. The asylum was the prototype. Everywhere else was the expansion. Ask yourself, how many systems in your life still strip individuality at the door? How many reduce you to a number, a file, a statistic? How many demand compliance disguised as healing, correction, or order? This is why the history of the asylum matters. Not because it was a failure, but because it was a success. A horrifying, devastating success. It achieved exactly what it was designed to do. It erased resistance, manufactured obedience, and prepared human beings for whatever came next. And what came next was far darker than the public ever knew. Picture the silence of a night ward. The groans have faded, the screams have been muffled. Patients lie strapped to beds, sedated into a twilight state between waking and unconsciousness. And then, footsteps echo down the corridor. Not the footsteps of an orderly making rounds, heels sharper, measured, purposeful, a clipboard clutched in one hand, a syringe in the other. This is the moment the hospital becomes a laboratory. The world outside believed these institutions existed to treat, to heal, to contain the broken until they could be restored. But within those high walls, another agenda pulsed. The patients had already been stripped of identity, silenced, reprogrammed. They were ready. And so the experiments began. The first wave was chemical, injections that came with no explanation. Pills pushed into palms with orders to swallow, no matter the effect. Drugs designed to sedate, to pacify, to test thresholds. Massive doses of insulin, enough to induce seizures and comas, administered in the name of insulin shock therapy. The theory was crude: break the body to reset the mind. Some patients woke days later trembling, others never woke at all. Deaths were chalked up to complications hidden beneath paperwork. Then came the psychiatric cocktails: amphetamines to agitate, barbiturates to sedate. Hallucinogens slipped into water cups, not for treatment but for observation. Notes scribbled in margins. Increased paranoia, delusional speech. Resistance decreased. No consent forms, no explanations. Just observation after observation, treating the human mind as a laboratory rat in a maze. And yet, even this was only the beginning. By the mid-20th century, the United States was locked in a shadow war, the Cold War, a war not only of bombs but of minds. Whispers circulated. The Soviets were experimenting with psychological control, brainwashing, mind-breaking, the AMS. American response was not horror. It was ambition. If the enemy could bend minds, then America would bend them further, faster, deeper. And so the walls of the asylum became fertile ground for one of the most chilling projects in American history. MKUltra. Declassified fragments reveal what was once unthinkable. State hospitals quietly absorbed into secret networks of government-sponsored research. Doctors with military funding testing drugs like LSD on unsuspecting patients, some given single doses, others force-fed for weeks. Hallucinations twisted into terrors, patients screaming at phantoms only they could see, begging for the walls to stop pulsing, for the insects to stop crawling under their skin. It wasn't just LSD, there were combinations: sedatives mixed with stimulants, barbiturates paired with hallucinogens, sleep-deprived for days, then pumped with chemicals, then shocked with electricity. The goal was not healing, it was dismantling, to see how far a mind could fracture, to learn how to implant commands into the broken pieces. Isolation chambers became chambers of horror. Patients sealed away in darkness for weeks, with only the sound of endless recorded phrases looping on speakers. You are not yourself. You will obey. You will forget. Over and over until reality itself dissolved. Some emerged babbling, some emerged blank, some never emerged at all. And behind it all, doctors smiled and wrote notes, their clipboards filling with the language of science while their subjects crumbled. But the scalpel too had its role. Psychosurgery went beyond the infamous lobotomy. Surgeons carved deeper, experimenting with new techniques to sever connections in the brain. Some procedures were crude, leaving patients vegetative. Others were more precise, cutting just enough to dull aggression, erase memories, flatten emotions. Records show patients once capable of reading, painting, speaking fluently, reduced overnight to incoherent muttering or blank stares. And then there were experiments never meant to be spoken of, the files shredded, the witnesses silenced. Testimonies whisper of radioactive traces injected without explanation, of viral strains tested in locked wards, of women sterilized under the guise of treatment, their ability to bear children taken without consent. Each story a fragment, too scattered to piece into the whole, but each echoing the same chilling refrain, that the asylum was a playground for those in power to test what could be done when the powerless had no voice. How many died from these experiments? Official records rarely admit. Some deaths were chalked up to natural causes, others erased altogether, the files vanishing along with the names. And those who survived, they were released into the world changed beyond recognition. Families wrote of loved ones who returned home docile, vacant, unable to recall their own past. Others spoke of survivors tormented by visions, paranoias. Sleepless, convinced the experiments never ended. Pause for a moment and let the scale sink in. Thousands of patients across the nation subjected to tests they never agreed to. Children, veterans, mothers, the poor, the forgotten. Their suffering recorded in margins of medical journals, hidden beneath terms like therapeutic trial or research study. And here lies the most terrifying truth. These experiments were not failures. They were successes, at least in the eyes of those who conducted them. The state learned how to sedate populations, how to condition obedience, how to erase memory, how to break the will of the resistant. Those lessons did not die with the closing of the asylums. They were exported into prisons, where chemical sedation became standard practice, into schools where unruly children were medicated into silence, into the military where techniques of psychological breakdown and reprogramming found new homes in interrogation rooms. The asylum was the testing ground. The world outside was the application. And yet, listen closely, the files we have are only fragments. Much was destroyed. Entire archives burned before they could be declassified. Entire wings of history erased. What we know is only the shadow of what truly occurred. The real story remains buried beneath redacted pages and silent graves. But even shadows can reveal enough to understand that the state hospital was never just a place of healing. It was a crucible where human identity was melted down, remolded, and sometimes annihilated. A place where the powerless were consumed so the powerful could learn how to control. And once you see that, once you hear the whispers that survived the shredders, one question remains. If this was what they admitted, what did they destroy? History does not erase itself. It is erased by someone. Walk into the dusty archives of a defunct state hospital, and you'll notice something strange. Patient files stacked high, but pages missing. Entire years blacked out. Death certificates signed without autopsy. Reports stamped confidential and tucked into locked drawers. The silence is deliberate. It has fingerprints. Cover-ups were not the exception. They were the rule. Consider the inspections. Every few years, the state would send auditors to check conditions. On paper, this was oversight. In practice, it was theater. Weeks before the visit, administrators would scramble the staff. Fresh paint on the peeling walls, patients given clean uniforms, their hair combed, their sores covered with bandages, the violent or malnourished hidden in basements or barns. Meals improved just long enough for inspectors to see. For 2 or 3 days, the asylum glowed with the illusion of care. And then, when the cars drove away and the signatures were inked, the illusion collapsed. Patients returned to starvation diets. The hidden were dragged back into overcrowded wards. The reports from those inspections? Glowing. Standards adequate. Care satisfactory. These were the lies that kept funding flowing, kept families assured, kept the public believing. And when deaths occurred, because they always did, the lies deepened. If a patient wasted away from malnutrition, the death certificate read natural causes. If someone died in a seizure induced by insulin shock, it was labeled complications. If a lobotomy left a patient unresponsive until their body finally gave out, the word pneumonia appeared instead. Families were handed a thin explanation, a body, and nothing more. Many never questioned it. They trusted the doctors. They trusted the state. But some families did question. Some wrote letters, begged for answers. Their replies came in the form of silence, or worse, legal threats. Administrators would claim records could not be released due to privacy. They would insist the staff acted with professional judgment. And in an era where doctors were gods in white coats, few dared challenge their authority. Behind the curtain, the machinery of concealment hummed smoothly. Hospitals filed only selective data to state boards. Statistics were massaged, numbers of deaths minimized, incidents of abuse omitted. Doctors who raised concerns were silenced, threatened with dismissal or quietly transferred. Whistleblowers almost never lasted long, and when the shadow of federal involvement entered, the intelligence programs, the chemical tests, the silence became ironclad. Think about it. MKUltra alone involved over 80 institutions, including hospitals, universities, prisons. Yet for decades the public knew nothing. Why? Because the CIA did not just shred files, they orchestrated a culture of silence. Doctors were told their work was patriotic, necessary for national security. Administrators were told to report nothing unusual. Any journalist who got close found doors slammed, sources drying up, or stories spiked by editors advised from above. The most damning files were destroyed in 1973, when CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the shredding of MKUltra archives. Thousands of pages burned, decades of experiments erased in hours. What survived was a fraction: financial records, stray memoranda, documents overlooked in the purge. Enough to prove the program existed, but not enough to reveal its full scope. Imagine what was lost. Imagine the stories buried in those flames. And yet, shadows leaked. Former patients began to speak in the 1970s and 1980s. Survivors who remembered strange injections, families who recalled loved ones returning home broken, blank, or altered. Court cases cracked open fragments of truth, like the lawsuit of Frank Olson's family, revealing that a CIA scientist had been dosed with LSD without consent before falling to his death. That case alone proved the government was willing to risk lives in pursuit of control, and if they would do it to their own scientist, what do you think they did to the patients society had already thrown away? But even when survivors spoke, they were dismissed. Delusional, schizophrenic, unreliable. The irony was grotesque. Victims of experiments were hidden inside diagnoses, their testimony discredited by the very stigma that made them vulnerable in the first place. And so the cover-up held, not because it was flawless, but because it was layered. Lies written on forms, statistics polished for reports, files burned, survivors silenced, families deceived, media controlled, the truth suffocated beneath bureaucracy. Yet there is a deeper horror here. The cover-up was not only about protecting reputations, it was about ensuring the lessons of control could be preserved, refined, and passed on. If the public had truly known the scale of the atrocities, the programs would have collapsed in scandal. Funding would have evaporated. The experiments would have stopped. Instead, the secrecy allowed the knowledge to flow quietly into other institutions: military black sites, corporate research labs, pharmaceutical testing grounds. The work never really ended, it simply changed address. Walk today through the ruins of an asylum and you can feel the absence, not just of the patients who lived and died there, but of the truth itself. Files missing, names erased, whole stories swallowed by silence. It is a haunting of omission. The ghosts are not only in the walls, they are in the gaps. And the most chilling realization: this machinery of concealment still exists. Governments still classify, redact, destroy. Corporations still bury damaging studies. Institutions still stage inspections for optics. The asylum may be gone, but the cover-up lives on, perfected in modern forms. Because when a system learns how to hide suffering once, it never forgets. So ask yourself, if the state could hide a century of cruelty in plain sight, how much of today's reality is also hidden? Imagine the scene. It is the late 1970s. A woman stands at a town hall meeting, clutching a faded photograph of her brother. Her hands shake as she speaks. He was 16 when the state declared him incorrigible and locked him away. For years, her family received only vague letters. He is improving. He is stable. He is in good care. And then, without warning, a call came. He has passed away. No details, no cause of death. Just a body, thin as a skeleton, lips sewn shut in a coffin the family was discouraged from opening. Now, decades later, she is demanding answers. She is not alone. Across America, through the 1960s, 70s, and into the 80s, families began to break the silence. Mothers who had buried children, veterans whose comrades had returned home from state hospitals, strangely altered, docile, blank, or suddenly violent. Survivors who carried strange scars, who remembered flashes of experiments, who lived with nightmares of cold metal tables, injections, or electric shocks that never stopped. And yet the world did not want to listen. Doctors dismissed them. Delusional, schizophrenic, paranoid. Newspapers buried their letters in the back pages. Courts threw out their lawsuits, citing insufficient evidence. Because what evidence could they bring? The records had been destroyed. The files had been falsified. The witnesses had been silenced. Survivors had only their voices, and their voices had been branded unreliable. Still, the cracks widened. In 1975, the U.S. Senate's Church Committee hearings revealed shocking truths about CIA programs, wiretapping, assassination plots, and yes, mind control experiments. For the first time, the words MKUltra entered the public record. The hearings confirmed what survivors had been saying all along. What drugs, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and psychological torture had been tested on unwitting subjects. But the details remained hidden. The files were gone. The committee could only glimpse fragments. Yet even fragments can ignite a fire. Survivors who had been dismissed suddenly had a vindication. They were not crazy. They were witnesses. Families realized their suspicions were not paranoid. They were justified. Journalists began digging deeper. Lawsuits multiplied. Take the case of Linda MacDonald, a Canadian woman who was admitted to the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal in the 1960s. She sought help for mild depression. Instead, she became part of Dr. Ewan Cameron's infamous psychic driving experiments, funded in part by the CIA. She was subjected to massive electroshock, heavy doses of experimental drugs, and weeks of recorded messages played on a loop while she lay unconscious. When she emerged, she had been erased, her memory wiped clean. She could not recognize her own husband or children. She had to relearn how to walk, how to cook, how to live. For years, she thought she was alone. But when MKUltra was revealed, her story became evidence, and in her voice the buried horror gained flesh. And she was not the only one. Survivors from prisons, hospitals, and orphanages began to surface. They spoke of drugs forced down their throats, of days spent in solitary darkness, of surgical scars with no explanations. Many had no names for what they endured, but they carried the weight of it in their bodies, in their nightmares. The tragedy is that so many voices never made it that far. Some died in silence, convinced no one would believe them. Others spoke only to be gaslit by the world. You imagined it. That never happened. To survive the experiment was one kind of horror. To survive the denial was another. But still, some voices carried. Activists began to organize. Families of the dead and survivors of the living formed groups, demanding accountability. They held vigils outside shuttered asylums, planting crosses to mark unmarked graves. They filed class action lawsuits against governments and hospitals, dragging the truth into courtrooms where it could no longer be ignored. Journalists, too, played their part. Investigative reporters in Boston, Montreal, and New York began piecing together timelines, tracking down former staff, unearthing scraps of forgotten records. Piece by piece, the picture sharpened, and in those pieces, the scale became undeniable. This was not one hospital, one rogue doctor, one tragic mistake. This was systemic, coordinated, sustained. But here is the most chilling realization. Even as survivors exposed the truth, they faced another wall of silence. not just from governments but from society itself, because to acknowledge what happened meant admitting something unbearable, that ordinary people, doctors and nurses, neighbors and officials had been complicit in a machinery of cruelty. It meant admitting that the state, the institution designed to protect, had been the predator, and so many people looked away. Even now, many do. Yet the voices remain. They echo in testimony, in memoirs, in interviews. They cry from unmarked graves. They live in declassified fragments, in shredded memos half preserved. And together they form a chorus too loud to be ignored. Think about it. If a mother, a veteran, a survivor stands before you, trembling, saying this happened to me, what is your instinct? To comfort? To listen? Or to doubt? The system counted on doubt. It weaponized disbelief. But every story told, every survivor who refused silence, chipped away at that weapon. The machinery of concealment had been strong, but the machinery of memory, human, fragile, stubborn, was stronger. And so, as survivors spoke, the asylum gates that had held for decades began to rust. The silence cracked. The truth bled through. Yet this is not a story of closure, because truth, once exposed, demands more than acknowledgement. It demands reckoning, and that reckoning has barely begun. Walk with me down a forgotten path. It winds behind a collapsed brick wall, past rusting pipes and the skeleton of an old boiler house. At first it looks like nothing, just weeds and crooked trees, but look closer. The ground dips in strange ways. Flat stones stick out like teeth, their engravings long eroded. And then you see it. Rows of markers, identical, small, stamped only with numbers. No names, no dates, just numbers. This is where the patients of the asylum were buried. Hundreds, sometimes thousands. Buried not in family plots, not with dignity, but in mass fields the hospitals called cemeteries. Yet these were not cemeteries in the way you imagine them. They were dumping grounds, fields of anonymity. Why numbers instead of names? Because the state wanted silence even in death. To engrave a name is to admit a life. To engrave a number is to erase. Across North America, these fields still exist, some overgrown, some fenced off, some paved over for parking lots. Each stone marks a person who lived, who was loved, who had a story, and yet who was stripped of identity in the final act of institutional control. And sometimes there are no stones at all. In the early 2000s, construction workers in New York unearthed a burial pit near the grounds of an abandoned psychiatric center. Skeletal remains, hundreds of them, many were children. No records explained why they were buried that way. Officials called it an oversight. Survivors knew it was not. In Texas, a historian researching asylum records discovered that thousands of death certificates had been filed without corresponding graves. Where were they? Burned? Dumped? Forgotten? And in Canada, at the site of the old Huronia Regional Center, families demanded access to burial records. What they found instead were contradictions, missing logs, falsified entries, maps that led to fields now covered by asphalt. Former patients recalled digging trenches, burying bodies without ceremony, without markers. The truth was not just hidden in files, it was buried in the earth. And still, families searched. Picture a woman kneeling in the grass, brushing moss from a tiny stone that reads number 1275. She knows her mother died here in the 1950s. She knows the hospital refused to tell her where, and now she kneels, hoping, praying that this number belongs to her. This is closure. A number in a field. Yet even this cold discovery is better than nothing. Because for decades there was not even acknowledgement that the graves existed. Hospitals denied it. Officials shrugged. They must have been released to families, they'd say. But families knew the truth. Their loved ones never came home. The graveyards reveal something more chilling than neglect. They reveal intent. The state hospitals did not just erase people in life through lobotomies, drugs and shock. They erased them in death. No funeral, no obituary, no record that they ever existed. Ask yourself, why? The answer is as brutal as it is simple. To admit a name, to admit a life, is to create accountability. A name demands memory. A name can testify. But a number can vanish into silence. And yet, silence does not last forever. In the 1990s and 2000s, as grassroots groups formed, many turned their energy to these forgotten cemeteries. Survivors and families raised money to install new markers, replacing numbers with names wherever possible. Some launched lawsuits demanding governments release burial records. Others staged vigils, planting flowers, lighting candles, refusing to let the dead remain anonymous. In Massachusetts, a group of activists restored the cemetery of the old Northampton State Hospital. They erected a memorial stone that reads, "Remember us, for we too lived, loved and laughed." In Ontario, survivors of the Huronia institution marched to the burial fields, carrying signs with the names of former residents. They chanted those names aloud, breaking the silence with memory. And still, many graves remain unmarked. Many bodies remain lost. But here is the darker question. What lies beneath the earth that has not yet been uncovered? Because scattered testimony suggests not every burial was natural. Patients who died suddenly. Patients who vanished from the ward. Patients whose families were told nothing, only that their loved one was gone. Were these deaths the result of experiments gone wrong, overdoses, restraint and neglect? No one knows, because the records are missing, the files burned, the bodies hidden. But the earth remembers what paper denies. Bones do not lie. Every unearthed cemetery is a ledger, a testament to lives cut short, to suffering silenced, to humanity erased. And each new discovery forces the question, how many more lie buried in fields we drive past every day, in forests where weeds grow tall, beneath buildings where children now play? The institutions thought the earth would keep their secrets, but secrets rot, secrets surface, and when they do, they demand answers, because every number was a name, every grave was a story, and every erasure is a crime. The asylum walls are gone now, but the ground beneath them still speaks. The truth was never meant to see daylight, but once survivors spoke, and once the cemeteries rose from the earth like ghosts, governments and institutions could no longer deny everything. What followed was not justice in the pure sense, but something closer to a war for memory, waged in courts, archives and headlines. It began with lawsuits. Families filed cases against state hospitals, orphanages and psychiatric wards. Survivors testified to abuse, forced drugging, sterilizations and unconsented experiments. At first, judges dismissed them. No evidence, they said, no records. But then lawyers pressed harder. Journalists leaked scraps of declassified files, and one by one cases began to stick. In Canada, the survivors of the Huronia Regional Centre launched a class action lawsuit in 2010. They told the court how children had been tied to beds, locked in closets, and forced to perform labor without pay. They spoke of physical abuse, sexual assault, and medical neglect. Government lawyers argued that it was the standards of the time. But survivors refused that excuse. After 3 years of legal battle, the government finally settled. $35 million in compensation, and more importantly, an official apology. But apologies are tricky things. When then Premier Kathleen Wynne delivered her statement, her voice trembled. She admitted that children had been abused, neglected, and denied the love and care they deserved. Survivors wept in the courtroom. Some said it was the first time the state had ever acknowledged their suffering, and yet others left bitter. How do you weigh a childhood stolen against a settlement check? How do you weigh decades of silence against a few paragraphs of regret? In the US, survivors of MKUltra experiments also fought for recognition. In the 1980s, 9 Canadian victims of Dr. Ewan Cameron's mind control research sued the CIA. Their case dragged for years, but eventually they won partial compensation. The CIA never admitted full guilt, instead settling quietly out of court. But the payout, though small, was still a crack in the wall of denial. And then came the declassified documents, through the Freedom of Information Act, FOIA. Journalists and activists pried loose fragments of the truth. In 1977, a cache of MKUltra files, thought to be destroyed, was accidentally discovered in a budget office. These 20,000 documents revealed chilling details: experiments with LSD on unwitting civilians, attempts to erase memory through electroshock, efforts to create hypnotic assassins. The files didn't cover everything, but they confirmed enough to prove survivors right. For the first time, the world could not dismiss them as delusional. The government itself had left the evidence behind, however unwillingly. And yet, notice the pattern. Whenever truth emerged, it was partial. Survivors dragged stories into the light. Governments admitted just enough to quiet the outrage. And then the silence closed again. Files were missing. Records could not be located. Lawsuits were settled out of court with no admission of liability. The machinery of secrecy shifted, but it did not stop. Still, survivors kept fighting. In Ireland, the Magdalene laundries, institutions where women were imprisoned, worked and abused under the guise of rehabilitation, finally faced government inquiry after years of denial. Survivors sat before panels and described forced labor, beatings and burials of infants in unmarked graves. The Irish state eventually issued a sweeping apology and established a compensation scheme. In Australia, the Forgotten Australians inquiry uncovered decades of abuse in orphanages and psychiatric institutions. Survivors testified that they had been used in medical experiments, beaten by staff, and subjected to psychological torture. The government acknowledged their stories with an official apology in 2009, calling it a stain on our nation's history. And yet, with every apology, one question lingered. Why now? The answer is as haunting as it is simple. Because they were caught. Not because governments wanted to confess, but because survivors and families refused to stop digging, refused to stop speaking, refused to let silence be the final word. And here's the darker truth. Even these apologies may not reveal the full scope. When governments admit to mistakes of the past, they frame them as isolated, a bad doctor, a misguided era, a tragedy we've learned from. But survivors know better. They know how it was systemic, widespread, intentional. To this day, files remain sealed, testimonies remain buried, and questions about how far the experiments truly went remain unanswered. Did the CIA stop MKUltra, or did it simply rename it? Did orphanages stop medical testing, or did pharmaceutical companies just shift to prisons and poorer countries? Did governments really close the books, or did they only close the doors? The lawsuits and declassified files gave the world fragments. Survivors' testimonies filled the silence with truth. But the complete picture, that remains hidden, and perhaps that was always the point. Still, every court case, every declassified page, every apology wrested from the state proves one thing. Memory is stronger than silence. Survivors, against impossible odds, dragged the machinery of power into the light. And in doing so, they reminded the world of a terrifying reality. The walls of the asylums may have fallen, but the logic behind them, the idea that the vulnerable can be experimented on, silenced, erased, still lingers in the shadows of modern institutions. The reckoning is not just about the past, it is about the present. And the question we must ask is this: how much of it is still happening right now behind new walls? We like to tell ourselves that the nightmare is over, that the asylums are gone, the graveyards restored, the experiments exposed, that we've learned, that society has moved on. But step carefully, because that's the story they want you to believe. Look closer. The walls are still there. They just have different names. Today they're called for-profit psychiatric facilities. They're called juvenile detention centers. They're called treatment schools for troubled youth. They're called private prisons. The language has changed, the branding is softer, but the logic is the same. Those deemed inconvenient, unprofitable, or difficult are locked away, medicated, and silenced. Consider the wave of lawsuits against troubled teen programs in the United States. Survivors describe being starved, beaten, restrained for hours, or drugged until they could no longer think clearly. Some were children with autism, others were simply labeled rebellious. The facilities called it therapy. The survivors called it torture. Or look at the modern psychiatric industry, where profit sometimes trumps care. Whistleblowers have revealed how some hospitals keep patients longer than necessary to maximize insurance payouts, using forced medication and isolation as tools of control. Families are told it's treatment. Patients know it's captivity. And then there are the prisons. Across the world, prisons have quietly replaced asylums as the holding grounds for the mentally ill. In the United States alone, studies estimate that nearly half of all prisoners suffer from some form of mental illness. They are warehoused, neglected, and often subjected to solitary confinement. conditions that drive people deeper into psychosis. Is this care, or is it the asylum by another name? The echoes are undeniable. Electroshock therapy, still used today, rebranded as ECT, often without fully informed consent. Drugging children with experimental medications, still happening in foster systems, where kids are prescribed cocktails of antipsychotics to keep them compliant. Unmarked graves. In Ireland, investigations into Catholic mother and baby homes revealed mass burial sites as recently as 2017, and pharmaceutical companies, modern heirs to the asylum's laboratories, continue to test new drugs on vulnerable populations. In the 1990s, reports surfaced of HIV drugs tested on foster children in New York without proper guardianship consent. The justification that they were wards of the state already under institutional care. The pattern is not just historical, it is current. Governments continue to suppress records, delay inquiries, and deny systemic abuse until the evidence becomes too overwhelming to ignore. And even then, the response is carefully managed. Apologies without accountability, settlements without admissions of guilt. But here's the darkest truth of all. Most of us still don't want to look. It's easier to think of the asylum as a relic of the past, a gothic horror story sealed behind crumbling walls. To imagine that the bad old days are gone. But if you peel back the layers, if you read the lawsuits, listen to the survivors, follow the money, you see the same machinery humming away, hidden in plain sight. Survivors today say what survivors a century ago said: no one listens, no one believes us, no one cares. And maybe that's the most chilling continuity of all. Because silence is not an accident. Silence is a strategy. When a child in a modern treatment center dies from restraint, the facility calls it an incident. When a prisoner with schizophrenia hangs himself in solitary confinement, the prison calls it suicide. When a psychiatric patient overdoses on the drugs they were forced to take, the hospital calls it non-compliance. Different words, same outcome. Lives erased, blame shifted, records sealed. The asylums may have fallen into ruin, but their shadow stretches into our present. It lives in every institution where the vulnerable are locked away, where experiments are disguised as treatment, where silence is enforced not with chains but with paperwork, jargon, and bureaucracy. And just like before, the truth only surfaces when survivors refuse to let go. They are the reason lawsuits are filed. They are the reason journalists dig. They are the reason cemeteries are uncovered, documents declassified, apologies forced. But the burden always falls on them. Alway eyes the survivors clawing their way against a machine designed to bury them twice, once in life and once in memory. So the question is not, was this real? The question is, how much of it is still happening right now, and how many decades will pass before we are finally forced to admit it? Memory has a strange way of working. It is never just about the past. For survivors, memory is a wound that never closes. It bleeds into the present. It shapes every silence, every fear, every mistrust of doctors, institutions, governments. For the rest of us, memory becomes something else entirely. A warning we're too afraid to hear. Because buried inside these stories, these cemeteries, these files, these testimonies, is a message about cycles. About how societies forget, and how forgetting allows repetition. Consider this. When the first asylums were built in the 18th and 19th centuries, they were advertised as progress, places of healing, sanctuaries for the mad who had once been chained in basements or displayed on city streets. The language was hopeful, humane, civilized. And yet, within decades, those very institutions devolved into prisons, laboratories, and graves. What began in the name of care ended in horror. Now look around today. How are new institutions being sold to us? Behavioral health centers promise cutting-edge therapy. Juvenile reform schools promise to save troubled kids. Biotech trials promise to cure the incurable. AI-driven psychiatric care promises to predict mental illness before it starts. It all sounds like progress, humane, civilized, just like before. But survivors whisper warnings. Listen carefully to the language of progress, because it always hides the shadow of control. Already, we see the signs. genetic testing to identify risk for mental illness in children, data-driven algorithms predicting who will become a criminal, pharmaceutical giants rushing drugs through trials on vulnerable populations. If history teaches us anything, it's that control always masquerades as care, and this is where myth and memory blur. In some survivor circles, there are stories of the ones who were never released, patients who vanished into underground wards, their names erased, their files shredded, families told they died of pneumonia or heart failure, but with no body, no grave. Are these myths, exaggerations born of trauma, or are they fragments of truth too dark for even official inquiries to touch? We know this much. When Canada investigated its institutions, it admitted only to what it could no longer deny. When the CIA declassified MKUltra files, it revealed only what had already slipped into public knowledge. When Ireland unearthed its mass graves, the Church admitted mistakes, but sealed countless other records. The lesson is chillingly clear. The worst is always what remains hidden. And here is the haunting possibility. Maybe the survivors are not just remembering the past. Maybe they are warning us of the future. Because look at the world we're building now. Surveillance woven into every device. Data on every heartbeat, every Google search, every prescription. Algorithms deciding who gets medication, who gets therapy, who gets locked up. What happens when that machinery is turned against the vulnerable, the inconvenient, the unprofitable, just like before? We tell ourselves that could never happen again. But survivors know better. They've lived through a world where doctors swore they were at helping while burying children in unmarked graves. Memory is not just history, it is prophecy. And here's the final truth. Survivors will always be the first to see it coming. They always were. They tried to warn us about the asylums, about the experiments, about the graves. No one listened. The only question left is, will we listen now? Because if not, the cycle will return. And when it does, it will not look like horror at first. It will look like progress. It always does. Here's the part no one likes to hear. You are part of this story. Not because you ran the institutions, not because you signed the papers, but because silence is the soil in which all of this grows. Think about it. How many times do you scroll past headlines about abuse in facilities without clicking? How many times do you hear about children dying in state care and file it away as just another tragedy, far away with no face, no name? That is how it happens. That is how it always happens. The asylums didn't thrive because of mad doctors alone. They thrived because communities looked the other way, because newspapers softened the truth, because families, ashamed, didn't ask questions, because ordinary people decided it wasn't their concern. The mirror is uncomfortable, but it is necessary. If survivors today say, "This is happening now," will you listen? Or will you decide once again that the story is too disturbing, too complicated, too far from home? Because if you look closely enough, you'll see it is never far. Every generation believes itself to be smarter than the last. We tell ourselves we'd never repeat the mistakes of history, but that's the illusion that makes repetition possible. Right now, across the world, there are locked doors you will never see. Behind them, children medicated into silence. Behind them, prisoners pacing in solitary confinement, losing their minds. Behind them, patients used in drug trials without their knowledge. Behind them, graves that one day someone will stumble upon. And when that day comes, when the files are leaked and the photos unearthed, when the truth can no longer be denied, people will say what they always say. We didn't know. We couldn't have imagined. We thought it was for their own good. But the truth is, you could have known. You just didn't want to. The warning is here. Survivors are speaking. The cycle is visible. The question is not whether it exists. The question is, will you let yourself see it? So here we are, at the edge of the story. You've walked through the graves. You've seen the shadows stretch into our present. You've heard the warnings of survivors. And now you must sit with the most haunting truth of all. History does not bury itself. People bury it. Institutions bury it. We bury it. Every silence is a shovel of dirt. Every denial is another layer of earth. Every indifference is a grave left unmarked. But graves do not stay hidden forever. Bones rise, files leak, survivors speak. The earth remembers what people try to forget, and maybe one day, years from now, someone will sit where you are sitting now, watching, listening, piecing together fragments of another scandal, another graveyard, another mistake. They will ask the same question survivors ask today. How could no one have stopped this? And the answer will be the same, because people didn't want to see. So listen, not to me, not to the institutions, not to the apologies that will come too late. Listen to the survivors. They are the only ones who ever tell the truth first. And their truth is not just about the past. It is about what's coming. The lights go down, the doors close, the files are sealed, and in the silence, the cycle waits.